to the Doris Stevens collection. She was the chair of a group, the Inter-American Commission of Women, for over a decade. And she has an enormous archive there that has letters, correspondence, pamphlets, newspaper articles from documenting feminist movements throughout the Americas. So it convinced me that this was a really big movement indeed that I didn't know about, but it wasn't until I then did research in Uruguay and in Cuba first that I really saw how Latin American feminists were corresponding with each other about this movement, saw that they had quite different notions of what the goals of this movement should be, that I realized that I saw the project taking shape.
Great, and that became your dissertation as well, or part of your dissertation?
Exactly.
Great. Yeah. Tanya, I'm asking you now the same question. What brought you to your project on Beatriz Allende?
So for me, it was, I think, a similar kind of curiosity upon discovering, figure that wasn't really known about before. So in the course of researching and writing my first book, which also grew out of my dissertation, I had come across Beatrice's name a number of times, and she'd been mentioned to me as someone who was really pivotal in relations with Cuba, but also really close to her father, Salvador Allende, during his presidency of Chile in the early 1970s. I knew that she had been married to a Cuban intelligence official. I knew she'd been a key figure in global solidarity with Chile after the Chilean coup in 1973. But beyond that, nothing really had been written about her. And I wanted to know more about this woman who seemed to me to have had a remarkable life, but also played really quite significant roles in Chile's revolutionary history at a young age. And so it was a curiosity about, okay, who was she and why has not more been written about her? So I was drawn to explore what it meant really to be a woman in the Cold War and during the height of kind of revolutionary change in Latin America, particularly as all the histories that I kind of had been reading, were tended to focus on the male leaders, on Miguel Enriquez, on Salvador Allende, on Che Guevara, on Fidel Castro, those who had kind of fought in guerrilla insurgencies, the majority of which were men. So I was interested about her. She hadn't been written about. This was a woman who had an important role in revolutionary politics, and I wanted to know more about what it was like to be a woman at the heart of these revolutionary kind of times.
Great, thank you very much. So Katherine, I'm going to ask you a question a little bit more detailed about your book and your research. You provide us a detailed account of the rise of feminism in the Americas by focusing on 6 pivotal players, 1 a US woman and 5 Latin American and Caribbean activists. How does your book give us a different perspective on feminist history during the years that you cover, which are from the end of World War I to the late 1940s?
Thanks, that's a great question. I think that standard narrative of feminist history in this era is that it was led really by US and Western European feminists, and that global feminism sort of took their lead and that they were the innovators. And what my research found was actually that Latin American feminists were really at the vanguard of innovative global feminist thought and organizing and innovation. And I found that these Pan-American dynamics were incredibly important to how Latin American feminists came together as a unit and self-identified in self-conscious ways as Latin American feminists and Latin American and Caribbean feminists. So in response to US feminists, pretty constant assumptions of superiority and in the world of feminist organizing, and also refusal to take on broader social demands and anti-imperialist demands that Latin American feminists wanted, Latin American feminists really increasingly turned to each other. And I really found that it was in the South-South organizing that they were doing that really came, that was really yielded their greatest strength. And this was especially true in the 30s and 40s, where I found just a tremendous amount of feminist vitality that grew really kind of organically out of anti-fascist movement organizing, communist and socialist organizing, labor movements, And it was a inter-American feminist politics that allied often with the Popular Front that really foregrounded women's productive and reproductive labor, demanded, for instance, maternity legislation from their countries, and also wanted to extend that legislation to domestic and rural working women. And this was something that was quite almost mainstream among a lot of feminists in Latin America in the 30s and 40s, and that was not happening in the same way in the US in terms of mainstream feminist demands. And at the same time, they were really innovating in the Inter-American Commission of Women, developing what was really a prototype for a human rights treaty with the Equal Rights Treaty, and at the same time using this synergy that was happening in the Popular Front of allying with different groups around anti-fascist, anti-racist, organizing that knit together a bunch of demands to articulate a human rights agenda as a set of interconnected rights and freedom from discrimination regardless of race, sex, class, religion, nation. And so it was sort of those two things that was really responsible for the tremendous influence they had in promoting human rights in these years. And it was a group of Latin American feminists who at the 1945 founding of the United Nations were responsible for pushing women's rights into the UN Charter, who were vehemently pushing for human rights in that charter, and who were responsible for proposing what became the UN's Commission on the Status of Women. And they did this over the objections of the US and British women who were delegates at this conference. So the book really does argue that it's this notion that women's rights are human rights, and even this notion of human rights, we have Latin American feminisms to thank for that.
Great, thank you. And so then Tanya, Beatriz Allende is born in 1942, around the time that Katherine's book ends. And that's a few years before the formation of the United Nations and the formation of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, and 6 years after the UN Charter for Human Rights. Did these important human rights and women's rights advancements have an impact on the life of the average Chilean female? And can you elaborate how Beatriz's life in particular tells of life in Cold War era Chile?
Yes, of course. I mean, on the question of its impact on the kind of these huge monumental kind of global developments and achievements that the transnational feminist movement were able to achieve in the mid-40s, the impact depends very much on which Chileans you're talking about. So I guess my answer is a very classic kind of historian's answer, which is yes and no. It had an impact, but it depends kind of who you were and where you were in Chile as to how much of an impact it had. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, you see the life of Chilean women, particularly in middle and upper classes, changing quite significantly. There's a much greater access to education. So you have rising numbers of women going to university. I think by the mid-60s, the women's enrollment in university has doubled. The Popular Front years, you have a lot of mobilization and political participation in politics. And of course, you've got the strong and politically diverse women's movement in Chile, the movement for the emancipation of women that Katherine details so brilliantly in her book, led by Marta Vergara, very active in Chilean politics in the 1940s. And this undoubtedly is one of the contributing factors that leads finally to women getting the vote in national and congressional and presidential elections in 1949. Now this seems very late in a sense in global terms, but in Latin America, it's one of the first after 1945 that does bring in, that expands suffrage finally to women voters, only literate women voters, of course. And so there is enormous changes in Beatrice's childhood in terms of the status of women and women's opportunities in Chile. But of course, as I said, and this offers Beatrice an opportunity to rebel and to space to kind of chart the kind of course in the future that she has that might not have been as possible for members of her mother's generation. But of course, the picture looks very different when we go and look on what's happening in different parts of Chile. You know, statements of equality and professions of equality and the right to vote don't necessarily mean that every woman voted. There was still considerable opposition to women's participation in politics, and a disinterest, a kind of lack of involvement in politics among some Chileans. So that I think in 1950, 65% of women were not active members of political parties, and only 60% of those eligible to vote. I mean, 60% of those eligible to vote didn't actually register to vote in 1950. So you have these huge advances that Katherine details in her book, and a very exciting moment, but actually translating that into everyday practices is slightly different. And yes, lots of women are in the workforce. 25% of the workforce in this period in Chile are women, but often they're employed in manufacturing where they can be paid less than their male counterparts. So you have equality in terms of getting into the workforce, but not necessarily in the way they're treated. Now, for me, it's striking. So, you know, during Beatrice's childhood and adolescent years, one of the things that's striking is that the ambition and the prominence and radicalism of the feminist movement that Katherine details in her book seems to recede, seems to kind of disappear, or at least it's muted. And one of the questions is why? You know, what happens to the mobilization of the feminist movement in the 50s? And I mean, there are a couple of things to point out here. One of which is that increasingly, well, the women's movement becomes very much focused on achieving the right to vote. And when this is achieved in 1949, much that had glued what was a very politically diverse and multi-class kind of coalition of women disappears. And so you have kind of the initiative and unity receding, and a lot of women moving into political parties to operate through those channels. But the other thing, and perhaps much more significantly, is the Cold War. The Cold War arrives with a vengeance in Chile, and in 1948, of course, you have a law that's passed which bans the Communist Party, strikes communist members off the voter registers, and for many of, you know, also sidelines many of the women who had been leading forces in the feminist movement early on. So when women were fighting for social and economic rights in kind of the more inclusive, expansive way that Katherine details in her book, they began to be dismissed and attacked for being communists or for being, you know, opponents to the Chilean way of life and kind of foreign agents in pushing these kind of demands. And increasingly, gender and women's rights and human rights become deeply politicized and contested in Cold War Chile. So it's a long way of getting to your second part of your question, which was about Cold War era and what Beatrice's life tells us about the Cold War era. I mean, following her life and its trajectory really helped me to understand how questions of gender intersected with the kind of more traditional kind of ideological conflicts at the time during the Cold War. But also, you know, it helped me understand kind of the way in which youth politics were politicized and became part of the Cold War. One of the things that really interested me was about what it meant to be a revolutionary youth in Chile in the long 1960s, and what it meant to be part of this generation that Beatrice was part of, that came of age during the kind of the era of the Cuban Revolution. So through following her trajectory, you know, my understanding of the Cold War and how I'd learned, you know, how I'd previously studied it really did start to change, and focus on how the Cold War really affected everyday life and the lives of young people, the lives of women, but also how those issues then in turn fed into what was actually being debated and contested in Chile as well.
Great, thank you so much. Let's talk some about your research. I have a couple of questions to ask you about what kinds of challenges you encountered while conducting your research, and about how far and wide you had to go to conduct your research. And maybe you could also talk to us about the archives you worked in as well.
Thank you. And I just wanted to echo too, I appreciated Tanya's response to that question. I just wanted to sort of reiterate also the way that how important I think the Cold War was in sort of reducing this previously kind of vital movement as early as the mid 1940s really into sort of a single issue feminism around the vote that was anti-communist. But in any case, on the research, I did research in almost all of the archival collections of the feminists that I studied or their organizations. I looked at feminists from Panama, Brazil, Chile, Cuba, Uruguay, and the United States. And then I also drew on archival research from Mexico and Argentina, looking both at feminist papers, but also foreign relations archives in these places. And I think that what I found as the biggest challenge was the fact that even doing all of this extensive, research in Latin America, I still felt like I had more material from the United States about Doris Stevens, for instance, who has an archive of over 62 linear feet at the Schlesinger Library, much of which is digitally available now. So it's a wonderful resource. But there's an unevenness to what's archivally available on of these feminists in Latin America than in the US. And I think this shapes the way we tell our feminist histories, of course. So it was a challenge, but then on the other hand, I also constantly found more than I was anticipating and expecting. Really the richest material for me came from seeing these letters that Latin American feminists sent to each other and how they were defining their own kind of politics and movement with each other. I think that also, it sounds mundane, but one letter from Clara Gonzalez in Panama to Ofelia Dominguez Navarro in Cuba stands out as being really significant to me. And it was where she was detailing the way that Doris Stevens refused to give her funding to travel to international conferences. Clara Gonzalez was one of the first appointed to the Inter-American Commission of Women right after the Pan-American Union appointed Doris Stevens as its chair. And as Clara Gonzalez points out in this letter, the funds should be equally available to all commissioners. And she realized that Doris Stevens was, in spite of the fact that Clara Gonzalez did research for the commission for 2 years while she was studying at NYU. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to do copious amounts of legal research that was then responsible for the commission creating this compendium of the legal status of women throughout the Americas that they then brought to The Hague and brought to these Pan-American Union conferences, was responsible for these innovations and treaties. Clara Gonzalez did not come from, she had a very humble, background, and she was not able to travel to these international conferences where Doris Stevens not only traveled, but stayed at lavish hotels using commission funding. So in any case, this really pointed out to me the way that financial resources were a critical issue here in terms of who was getting a platform, whose feminist politics were getting international play, and also to the conflicts and the ways in which Latin American feminists realized that this was connected to economic imperialism, which they were always critical of in terms of political economy of US imperialism. And so it was just one of these really interesting and sort of revealing letters. And it also was very different from how Clara Gonzalez wrote to Doris Stevens too. So the power dynamics here I found very interesting.
Great, thank you. And Tanya, would you like to talk to us about your experiences in the archives and in your research?
So Beatriz Allende was not a particularly easy figure to research. I kind of wish I'd known that before I started, but in the course of exploring and examining her life, that there was some obvious unevenness in kind of the record in the archival record that pertained to her life. and reasons why she had been silent in the archive. She didn't hold an official role in the Socialist Party. Like many women, she was an active participant, but didn't hold a leadership role, and so doesn't necessarily figure in institutional party histories, for example. But there are other reasons why she was difficult to kind of research, one of which is her covert revolutionary work. Covert revolutionary and clandestine revolutionaries don't often leave a very nice paper trail. In fact, they do everything they can to destroy the paper trail. So one of my interviewees told me of Beatrice decoding messages from Havana, from her bedroom in Santiago, on tiny little bits of tissue paper that she then memorized. And of course, the first thing she then did is burnt. That a lot of her contacts, her friends, remember her impressive memory. In fact, they talk about her terrible handwriting, which was a problem for me, but that's another story. But she relied on her memory to communicate and to be part of many of these revolutionary networks, which is obviously very hard to gain access to. The other reason she's silent is what happens in 1973, the coup. And so one of the things that happens after 1973 in Chile is that the military moves to try and destroy and eradicate much of the kind of political landscape and imaginaries of not just the left, but of a whole kind of democratizing tradition that had been opening up in Chile. And I found it very hard, for example, to access information about her student years, her radical student politics. Many of the student newspapers she contributed to have been destroyed or burned. There's no trace of them. So finding out about her was a kind of involved quite a bit of detective work and casting the net wide. I was very lucky, I think, like Katherine, to be able to gain access to some of her letters and her correspondence. She wasn't an intellectual. She didn't write lots about her political thought. She was one of the revolutionary left who believed in action rather than theory. And, but her letters really reveal a lot. And in this respect, I gained access, or I was very fortunate to be given access to two collections of her correspondence. One, love letters that she wrote to her, who became her husband, the Cuban intelligence official, when she was in Chile and he was in Cuba in the late 60s and early 70s, were right just before her father became president. And the second was on her solidarity work. So her correspondence as an exile in Cuba. And these are very different types of correspondence, but they allowed me to gain access to some of her personal kind of thoughts, but also her commentaries on what was happening around her. I mean, I think on the unevenness for me, of course, solidarity work compared to clandestine revolutionary work does rely on communication, on written reports, on a paper trail. And so for me, there was a lot of material on the solidarity years and not so much on the early years, which I grappled with in terms of trying to kind of bring together a coherent history of her life. In terms of surprising things, I mean, I could go on and talk a bit more about the material, but in terms of surprising things, I mean, one of the ways in which I tried to get more information and cross-reference kind of interviews and the correspondence was to look outside, at right angles, and to look in kind of diplomatic and intelligence reports from US, UK, Chilean, Mexican intelligence reports on the Chilean left. And through these reports, I was able to kind of gain a better sense of exactly the context in which Beatrice was living and operating. And one of the most striking things that I discovered through that, and kind of startling, was how informed the Chilean dictatorship was about what the Chilean left were doing after 1973, and the high level of the informants that they had within some of the Chilean left and solidarity circles, which was striking. So I was in the diplomatic archives in Santiago thinking, okay, what are the dictatorship's papers going to tell me anything about Beatrice? And obviously they're not going to tell me about her directly, other than the fears that the military had about her. But they did reveal the vulnerabilities of the networks that she was helping to construct, and it served to affirm many of her own preoccupations at the end of her life about security and about vulnerabilities that the left faced, and really kind of actually confirm rather than her fears and anxiety when some around her thought she was being paranoid and worried about them. So I think the kind of having to cast the net wide sometimes can throw up some interesting observations about exactly the balance of forces that were involved in these histories. I mean, so I think in both of our work, I mean, we had to do some digging to kind of recover the voices of these women who had somewhat been forgotten. And I guess if I had a question for you, Katherine, and one that I ask myself a lot as well, is why hasn't more been written about these women before? You know, why did it kind of take a lot of digging and then kind of, you know, cross-referencing these different materials to piece together this history of, you know, in your case, very prominent international network, and in my case, a kind of figure that had much more of an involvement in the Chilean left than others had kind of given her credit for.
Yes, thanks. And I would love to hear your response to that question too, in your case. I mean, it's true. I was really struck when I would look at Latin American newspapers from throughout the region by how much attention the press was actually giving to these inter-American feminist initiatives. So you're right, the network was prominent and it was being talked about. And I also think that there are ways in which these feminists in their countries have been remembered, some more than others. But on the other hand, their transnational connections weren't quite, I think, known. And I think part of that is also the way it does take kind of transnational research, piecing one piece of correspondence from, you know, Dominguez's archive in Cuba together with Luisi's archive in Uruguay, with Gonzalez's in Panama. I mean, I was really amazed. And then when I did research in Bertolet's archive in Brazil, found that she was corresponding with Luisi in a way I had no idea about too. The density of these interconnections did sort of require this this tracing of these connections from different archives. But I also think that there has been this sort of amnesia over the vitality of feminisms in this period of the 30s and 40s. It's now kind of being recaptured, as you and I have been talking about a little bit. And I think it's exciting to see now the way in Chile, for instance, just in 2019, there was a big mural project and of women's leaders in Valparaiso, and Marta Vergara's mural was painted on a bus station there. And of course, there's been this tremendous surge of feminist activism in Chile, but not only in Chile, but throughout the Americas, really. And I think that this is an opportunity not only to reclaim these national feminist leaders who had these broad intersectional politics, but to realize that they were linked in a hemispheric movement in this period, in this earlier period, because I think it helps empower the movements today to know that this past, this really robust kind of radical past existed. What are your thoughts on why Beatriz Allende hasn't been remembered? I mean, I'm curious too to hear about your process of oral history research, and if, because it seems like that was critical for sort of also realizing that she did have, that there is some degree of collective memory around her that might evade a paper trail, but perhaps exists in terms of people's memories.
I think, I mean, one of the things that's so interesting, and I think actually kind of ties our work together, is kind of the growing resonance of our histories in contemporary affairs, right? So, I mean, I think I was also struck in, you know, when thinking about your work in relation to what's happening now in Chile, about the prominence of social economic rights, the anti-racist kind of activism among the feminist movement as well, and how a lot of, you know, your actors' demands are still on the forefront of the feminist agenda, or maybe they went away with the prominence of the individual, focus on the individual right. But I feel like it's very important to, and I think when, you know, the social awakening that has happened in Chile has been also looking to the past as well, and thinking through how it might inform the present, but also how it might inform kind of future alternative projects. I mean, when it comes to Beatriz, I think compared to when I started research, there is a growing interest in her, and she's far less forgotten than she was 10 years ago. There was a biography written about her in Chile, a very, very good one recently, that really tried to kind of recover her for present day leftists and young activists as a kind of someone to follow, or kind of draw inspiration from. And I think the interest comes from a number of reasons. One is the resurgence of kind of young activism from the 2011, the student protests, young people very much kind of leading kind of calls and questioning of the political, social, economic order in Chile, which is really the inheritance from the transition to democracy that happened in 1990, and really questioning the neoliberal model. And young people, partly because they don't have memories of the dictatorship and what it was like under the dictatorship. So I think many have suggested there's a freedom from those kind of fears of the past, have been really leading the call for change. And in that youth mobilization, you know, there's been echoes of the past in numerous ways, but Violeta Parra's kind of song about students is being kind of sung everywhere. Victor Jara is being sung everywhere. And I think within this context, Beatriz has kind of been, or people have been questioning what she did, who she was, and I mean, the other reason is why she wasn't talked about more before. And there are a number of reasons why she was silenced for a while. I mean, one of them is the way she died. So we haven't spoken about it, but for those who don't know, she died of suicide in 1977. She took the decision for various reasons, and I don't think we'll ever really know exactly why. But beyond that, and it was controversial at the time in revolutionary circles, because the idea is you fight to the death, and particularly in Cuba, and also in Catholic societies, suicide was looked on as a taboo. The other reason, of course, is that the transition to democracy that happened didn't privilege her left-wing vision of revolution and change. It kind of brought to the fore a much more social democratic view of history, and kept kind of neoliberal systems and power and economics and politics. And the kind of long 1960s, the engagement with civic society, social mobilizations disappeared, and she became rather an awkward figure because she was very close to her father, and she brings out a lot of information on his ties to the revolutionary left that is quite awkward for those who were painting particularly perhaps a different view of Salvador Allende and of the renovated left that was assuming kind of inheriting kind of the democratic transition in Chile. So it's complicated, but I think people are interested in her because of the turn in Chilean politics today.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up her death and her suicide. I mean, your book is extraordinarily moving and really demonstrates the human pain of exile in a way I had never really experienced while reading a book. I thought it was really powerful and moving. And you also really demonstrate the vitality of the 60s and 70s, the new lefts in Latin America and Chile. I thought it was also kind of heartbreaking that she dies right before this feminist resurgence in Chile is really instrumental in sort of speaking out against the dictatorship too. I just wondered if she had lived to see that, if that might have had some resonance with her. because of course, you know, from the 70s to the 80s, there's this, there's so much tremendous, you know, women are in the streets protesting, and something that I find so resonant about this kind of feminism that they're promoting at this time, that I also think is kind of a hallmark of feminism regionally in the Americas, is the way they are connecting structural forms of economic and social oppression under the dictatorship with sexual liberation, with women's rights, with domestic violence. And you see that in the activism today of Las Tesis, their anthem that went transnational, The Rapist in Your Path, which is also about connecting this, this notion of the way of domestic violence with state violence, like from the police, from the judiciary. And in some ways connects also with this 1930s and 40s moment that I'm writing about, in which they weren't talking about sexual violence, but they were talking about these interconnected sort of forms of structural and personal oppression. So any case, I see this sort of through line through our books and then to the moment that's happening today, especially in Chile, but in other parts of the Americas too. So,
yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, the interesting thing for me is Beatrice, I don't think would have ever called herself a feminist. I mean, that's the striking difference, I guess, between our protagonists. Although I think in the 30s and 40s, there's this tension between kind of class and feminism and what to prioritize in kind of looking for radical change. But for those of, she found, I think she didn't write explicitly, I wish she had, about kind of feminism or women's rights. But like, I mean, in terms of the interviews, which I did have to rely on, coming back to the oral history, I mean, you know, all the people, what I was struck by is how many people wanted to talk to me because they felt that they wanted to recover her memory, that they owed her a debt in terms of, by speaking about her, because she'd been kind of almost silenced in the histories, that they wanted to kind of remember her. But one of the things that they all referred to is, you know, women's rights, feminism wasn't on the agenda. It was the revolution. It was the class. It was the workers' revolution first, and all that would come later. And feminism at this stage was regarded as, you know, bourgeois, imperialist kind of effort to undermine the revolution or divide it at worst. Yes, there was a tension. Although I think she was a feminist. You know, there's unquestionably in her thoughts, her actions, and what she was trying to achieve. I think there may be questions from the audience that I should stop.
Sorry, this discussion is so great, the discussion between the two of you, and but we do have questions. So I'd like to pause now and ask some of the questions from the audience. The first one is for Katherine. Have you seen much of your primary sources about Latin American feminists addressing women's health matters?
That's a great question. Paulina Luisi was actually an obstetrician, and so she did research extensively and talk about this. She's a problematic figure. She was actually initially a eugenicist, as many socialists were actually in this period. She was also part of this sort of neo-Lamarckian form of Latin American eugenics that was more about sort of social factors, but this is still, you know, ultimately a racist and one would say genocidal kind of politics. She shifts politics actually in the 30s and 40s to become much more anti-racist and explicitly anti-racist. So that is sort of an encouraging change that happens. But I think that she also is really engaged in trying to raise public education and conversation about women's reproductive health in these years as well. I see though more among like the communist feminists in the 30s and 40s, like Marta Vergara, Ofelia Dominguez Navarro. They're promoting safe and legal abortion and birth control access. And this comes more from a socialist politics than from like a sex positive kind of modern politics, but it's definitely related, of course, to women's health.
Great, thank you. And the next question is, excuse me, for both authors, what is it like working with an editor and a publisher, and what role do they play in your final book?
I would say it's wonderful to find an editor who has faith and believes in the project. And I was very lucky to be able to meet with Elaine Meisner, who very early on said, okay, you know, let's see what you've got on the project. They play a role in encouraging you to finish and submit a final manuscript once they're interested in the project, and really working to help you refine it. So I have to say that the book, as it turned out, is actually a lot shorter than the original one I wrote, and the process of cutting and refining was painful. I think for most writers, editing is a painful process, but ultimately made it a much better book. So I think I'm very grateful to my editor, but also the copy editor, for helping me to refine and make it more, you know, a readable, manageable book in the end. But yeah, and it's great also, I think, at UNC, the series they have also help really put us in conversation, and a lot of kind of those of us working on similar projects in conversation with each other. So yeah, that's my own take on that question.
Anything else, Katherine?
I would like to take the opportunity to thank UNC Press and Mark Simpson-Voss and Kate Hodorix for helping me cut words, tell a story, and yeah, just echo everything Tanya said and provide this opportunity for us to be in conversation with each other. So,
another question for the both of you. Are your books going to be translated and available in Spanish?
I hope very much that it will. I haven't unfortunately got any answers on that in terms of immediate translation or publication. But as with my first book, I strongly believe that it should be translated, because in writing about Beatriz and in writing about Chile, I'm not really writing primarily for just an English speaking audience. You know, the people that I want to talk to about Beatriz are Chileans and Latin Americans, and about Latin American Cold War politics, because I think, you know, it's not just about interest, but I learned so much from them as well. And for me, kind of writing is not just a solitary exercise, but it's about starting a conversation. And so I really would like it to be translated, and I'm hoping that happens soon. So, yeah.
I feel the same way. I don't have any immediate plans, although I'm really hopeful that that it will happen. It is also kind of one of my biggest dreams to have the book in Spanish, because I, like Tanya was saying, really would love for the audience of Latin American readers to read this history. And so I'm hopeful that it will happen sometime.
Great. Katherine, another question for you. I wonder if you could discuss the process of turning, excuse me, the dissertation into a book. Given the expansive research or reach and archival journey, how does the dissertation differ to the book project? And what was that process like? I don't know if we have enough time for that. We have 4 minutes.
I can be short. I mean, basically, I had only done the research in Cuba and Uruguay and in US archives when I did the dissertation. So after that, I then expanded the research to Panama, Brazil, other archives in the US. And it was really only then that I really realized the vitality of Popular Front Pan-American feminism in the 30s and 40s, that I realized there was this profusion of feminist groups that I don't even really thoroughly explore in the book, but that this was really quite a big movement. And also the human rights argument became a much stronger part of my book than the dissertation. So I think it broadened the project quite a lot. Thanks for that.
Great. This is for the both of you. Given the rich history of Pan-American feminism in the 30s and 40s that Professor Marino so richly details in her work, how did feminism by the 60s and 70s in Latin America become equated with bourgeois ideology, at least for the Latin American left, as Professor Harmon mentioned?
Katherine, should I go with that? I think maybe I'm giving a simplistic view of kind of feminism on the left. I mean, there's huge kind of the left pushes for women's rights, for many of the same rights that Katherine's protagonists are fighting for in the 30s and 40s when it comes to abortion, legal status and equality for illegitimate children, divorce, access to education, healthcare, maternity rights. I mean, these are all things that are still very much on the agenda, and they are for the left. I think what is different is about what they're called, and so I don't think the left are talking about feminism, but they are talking about rights. They're talking about equality, and they're talking about social justice. I think one of the reasons it becomes equated is because of the particularly type of focus on kind of individual rights that takes place in the 60s and 70s, but also a rather a kind of suspicion of some of the women's liberation movement, some of the practices in the United States, some of the feeling that much of what was happening was a kind of happening elsewhere as well. I don't know, Katherine might have other views on this.
Yeah, no, I think that you did that makes, that really is a helpful response. And I think something I've been really struck by is the way that some really anti-communist right-wing women were pivotal in the Inter-American Commission of Women in the mid to late 40s and 50s and early 60s. So you have, a lawyer from Paraguay who is really connected to the Stroessner regime, who's arguing for women's suffrage and anti-communism in the same breath, and upholds feminism as her project and ideology. I think that this is not just happening in Paraguay, but in other countries where dictatorships are trying to burnish their international credentials by saying that they are promoting women's suffrage or very narrow notions of women's rights. And so in a way, I think this is partly why the left rejects feminism in this period. But I think, though, that I always refer to Jocelyn Alcott's wonderful book on International Women's Year. I mean, she really shows how things are shifting in the 70s and 80s in Latin America. I think that, in these encuentros feministas of Latin American and Caribbean feminisms that emerged, the first ones in Bogota in 1981, the debate is really between, these leftist versus feminist ideologies, and how do we bring these together, or are they separate? And I think that there's increasingly more synergy, so that by the time of the Nicaraguan Revolution, there's a real meaningful influence that feminism has in terms of how, they shape the revolution, and feminism, I think, becomes somewhat more acceptable among the left by that time. But I think that, there's sort of a dialogue between the left and feminisms in these years that's productive.
Well, I'm sorry that we're drawing to the end of our conversation. I want to thank you both so much for spending this time with us. I apologize to those that asked questions that we didn't get to. And I hope that there's further conversation in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria.
Yes, thank you, Teresa. Tanya, Katherine, I'm so grateful to you for sharing your work with us today, and frankly, for letting us be audience to this amazing conversation about it. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Don't forget to visit uncpress.org to use that 40% off discount that we sent you when you signed up for this event to buy these books. I wanted to note that the UNC and Duke Working Group on Gender and Sexuality in Latin America and the Caribbean is discussing Dr. Marino's book in early October with a virtual visit on November 6th. And so if you're interested in that, look up the UNC and Duke Working Group. And the final thing I'll say is that I hope we'll see you at our next Off the Shelf event, which is on Thursday, October 15th at 5:30 p.m. with Dan Royals, who will be presenting his book, To Make the Wounded Whole, the African-American Struggle Against HIV/AIDS. And he'll be in conversation with Stacy Torian, one of our health sciences librarians. Thank you once again, Katherine, Tanya, Teresa, and all of you for being here with us. Have a great day. Goodbye.